Hey everybody, I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast, and today's a special day because we're doing the TMBH Mailbag. And then over the weekend, I was going to write a little TMBH Mailbag song, and it was going to be really good, but things got busy and caught up with me a little bit. It was going to be like 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast, Mailbag, it's a mailbag. And then for everybody's got such good questions about the things that we're talking about, and we're going to look at the questions and answer the questions. It's not done yet. I'm still workshopping it. It's obviously very close, but doesn't have the full spit shine. But just imagine that we'd done that. Jeff does the music on here. He was busy and stuff, and so he didn't have a chance. But speaking of Jeff, the first question/comment that I want to look at is from a guy named Fun Thief. And he acknowledges things about Jeff and the music in general around here. So here's how it goes. Hey, Matt, really liked today's episode. I was super excited yesterday when I heard you were going to talk about the counterfactuals in Matthew, as it is one of the big reasons I've been looking into different systems of thought on the nature of free will and predestination. But how do you think God's knowledge of true counterfactuals, that is what ifs, plays into that? I've heard some espouse a Molinist view of free will that states that because God knows what a free creature would do in any situation, he can have total sovereignty over the universe while not destroying the creature's freedom. But I'm unsure about the strengths and weaknesses of this point. Also, great choice for the ending music. That made me laugh out loud. From Oklahoma State University, Ryan. Okay, Ryan, first of all, just quick side note, Jeff does all that music once again, and he is spectacular. Anytime that we venture away from the normal intro-outro music, there's an Easter egg there. It means something. I think it's really fun goofing around that way. Those are all pastiches, not straight covers, because Jeff likes to do all kinds of interesting things musically. So I'm very glad to hear that you're having fun with that as well, Ryan. To your question, Fun Thief, or Ryan, as we now know his name to be, brings up Molinism as almost a third option for what to do about the relationship between God's sovereignty and human freedom that usually breaks down into a simple bipolar spectrum of predestination or free will, or to put it another way, Calvinism and Arminianism. A lot of people think of Molinism as being a hybrid position between the two. I don't think the guy who came up with Molinism, I think his name was Luis de Molina. I always want to say Alfred Molina, but that's the black hat wearing cowboy baddie in Maverick. Luis de Molina, I think, was writing in Spain in the 16th century, and it doesn't look like he was a part of the largely Protestant debate about free will and predestination. It looks like he was working out a different math question. So whereas the Calvinist-Arminian debate that Ryan or Fun Thief brings up here really is a debate that has to do with God's sovereignty and human freedom, that place in the Venn diagram where those two overlap, what does it look like? Or do the two circles completely overlap? That is a separate debate from what Molina was trying to tackle. Molina was starting with a higher level question than even that. He was starting with the question of, what are the implications of God being infinite? Really, truly infinite. If God is infinite, Molina reasoned, then he knows everything. Everything that was, everything that is, everything that will be, and everything that could be, as well as everything that might have been. There is no conceivable version of reality, either one that looks very similar to the one you and I are living out, or one that looks wildly different from the one that you or I are living out, that God has not fully thought through. And further, God has always known the answer to what every possible conceivable reality would look like. If God is truly infinite, Molina would argue, God cannot learn anything, and he's always known everything. And Molina goes on to say, okay, well, in some atemporal moment, God gamed all of that out. But it's atemporal because he always knew. Then, in another atemporal moment, he made a decision to say which one of all of those infinite permutations of reality that he gamed out in his infinite mind would he like to actualize, to turn into a real reality. Maybe there are more than one. We're only aware of one for sure, but definitely he made one of those things that he thought through, and that by definition is God. He must know everything about past, present, and future. He made one of those into reality. And Molina argued that the rationale behind God choosing whichever one he chose and rejecting all the ones he rejected is that the one he chose must most accomplish his purposes. I can't think of anything that would be more definitive of what his purposes are than the pursuit and demonstration of his own glory. But I suppose there could be some debate about what God is actually going for. I don't know. To me, it doesn't even seem debatable. It just seems like that would be it. So, in answer to Ryan/Fun Thief, I think the only place where I might offer some constructive reframing in response to your question would be the notion that somehow Molinism is the halfway point between predestination and free will, the halfway point between Calvinism and Arminianism. I think Molinism answers a different question entirely. The free will advocate could go up to the higher level question of what are the implications of God's infiniteness and say, oh, that Molinist construct, that makes a ton of sense. And look at that. In this version, you have even more freedom as an individual than you do in my free will version, because here you got to pick everything, ever. A version of reality where you picked everything that you could possibly ever pick and were everything that you could possibly ever be has been fully gamed out in the mind of God. Now, all of those ultimately got rejected, except for the one that we know exists. But, wow, that's an even freer position than the Arminian version of free will. So you could make that argument. The predestination Calvinist advocate could step out of this debate and up into the larger overarching question that Molina was trying to deal with and say, wow, in a way, you're even more determined because God ran an infinite number of simulations of an infinite number of realities and found all of the other ones wanting. Therefore, this course of action and decision-making for you is more than even just one about do you get picked to be a Christian or not. It is even more limiting on free will because all the little decisions of your whole life are all intimately connected with all the other little things that happen in the version of reality that God picked. So if this feels a little bit crazy heady, well, when you're dealing with an infinite God and you're asking questions about what that infinite God must be like and what he's thinking, and we're asking that from a finite perspective, we get into some weird places. Bottom line is this. If God is truly infinite, how does that square with reality? He must know everything. Therefore, he must have thought about everything. There's nothing you can know that he doesn't know. You can't surprise an infinite being by being like, what if they're horses, but they're purple? It's not like God's going to be like, what? Purple horses? I didn't even think about that. What if there were purple horses? That's some really creative, helpful feedback. Thank you for that, Matt. It's not going to happen. He already thought about the purple horses thing, and he skipped the purple horses thing. Molina is dealing with a higher level question, and I, for one, don't find his thoughts on this to be particularly threatening to any other preferred system of theology, save maybe open theism, which is a deeply minority position where some would argue that God doesn't actually know the future. God doesn't actually know all the counterfactuals. He can be surprised too. And if that's the case, then you're talking about a lesser character, not the infinite God that the Bible describes or that the word God intones. Ryan, great question. Thank you. I really want to get to a couple more of these. Okay, Ben Creative put together a post that is just hanging out on the TMBH podcast subreddit, which is r/TMBH podcast at reddit.com. I think we link to it in the show notes on all of these. He went through and painstakingly organized everything, what we covered in what episode and where and what text. It is crazy helpful. And if you are just picking this up or you want to remember where something is, I need to pin this post. I'm going to do that right now. Wait, listen to these clicks. I'm going to do this right now, and then it's going to be pinned, and it'll always be sitting there right at the top. But I have to scroll forever because it's so gigantic. Make announcement. Ba-ba. There. Now you'll be able to find it right at the top of r/TMBH podcast whenever you go there and hang out. And if Ben does any updating, then I'll do some updating to that as well. Thank you, Ben, for a ton of work. I was flabbergasted when I saw that. Okay. Wow, I hear from Taz Jess. Taz Jess, I like you. I have seen you around the internet for years, and you are always such a positive presence in every room, everywhere I run into you. Twitter, talking about no dumb questions or other things that I do. You're always making stuff better. I really appreciate you. Waddy Pilot, I don't know you either, but both you and Taz Jess apparently are planning for your gold star pizza parties, and I'm really excited for you to get to have those. Once again, anybody who listens to all the episodes of the podcast for this first year that we just finished and next year is going to receive 2 gold stars, and anyone who gets 2 gold stars can have a pizza party at the location of their choice with whoever they'd like to invite at their own expense at the time of their choosing to celebrate. So congrats on being that close to your pizza parties, you too. Okay, acknowledging that this is going to be a little bit of a long one because it's a mailbag episode and I want to get it all in one. Here's another question or comment from Marvin Bear. I recently had a question that came to mind over John's disciples. If John's purpose was to point to Jesus, then why didn't John and his disciples follow Christ? After John baptized Jesus, wouldn't he and many of his disciples begin to follow Jesus? Unless I'm reading the text wrong, it seems as though John kept preaching and he stayed in the wilderness with his disciples until he was arrested. I can understand John staying to preach the good news, but I'm confused on why his disciples wouldn't move on to follow the one John was pointing to. Great question. And let me just add to that. Great responses. There's some really thoughtful comments here from Dimes on His Eyes. Hey, I know you from around the internet as well. You always make things better too. Rematched 33, The Journey to God, Common Judge 8434. Looks like all 4 of you jumped in and pointed to the larger record on the subject of the Gospels. Over in the Gospel of John, you get, I thought I knew where it was. It's in the fairly early going. Here it is. John 1:35, you get this. The next day, John the Baptist, I added the Baptist, but that's who it is, was there again with 2 of his disciples. When he saw Jesus passing by, he said, "Look, the Lamb of God." And when the 2 disciples heard him say this, they followed Jesus. Turning around, Jesus saw them following and asked, "What do you want?" And they said, "Rabbi," which means teacher, "where are you staying?" "Come," he replied, "and you will see." So they went and they saw where he was staying, and they spent the day with him. It was about the 10th hour. Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, was one of the 2 who heard what Jesus had said and who had followed Jesus. The first thing Andrew did was to find his brother Simon and tell him, "We found the Messiah, that is the Christ," and he brought him to Jesus. Jesus looked at him and said, "You are Simon, son of John. You will be called Cephas," which when translated is Peter. Marvin Bear, part of the reason I appreciate your question so much and picked it for the mailbag episode is because it brings up a really tricky question that I didn't tackle, I guess because of time. I don't know. We can go back and do it some other time. And that is the question of how the gospel accounts reconcile with the calling of the earliest disciples. Some people will look at this and say this is one of the real weaknesses in terms of continuity of the gospel accounts. I look at it and surprise, surprise. I mean, I like the Bible. I usually end up coming down on the side of, no, I think it works. But I look at it and I think it kind of works. But in fairness to those critics, I got to admit, it's a little bit squishy. I mean, it takes more work to reconcile this than most stuff between the Gospels. It looks like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are all dealing with this thing in a little bit different chronological order. But to your question, Marvin Bear, it looks like Andrew, and anytime in John we get this unnamed bonus disciple, that's usually John, like John, the gospel writer John. It looks like they were following John the Baptist. They probably still had jobs, but they were spending time with John the Baptist. It wasn't that far from where they worked, probably. And so maybe they were in and out there. Maybe they did a whole period of time there. But when they run into Jesus, John had been saying, hey, like there's somebody coming. It's a big deal. He had pointed people who, well, no, not had. He does point people in John chapter 3 after the Jesus and Nicodemus part of the Bible. He points disciples to like, Jesus, that guy over there. No, he's not a rival or an enemy. He is the guy. It looks like some of John's earliest followers did recognize Jesus and jumped in and followed him. It looks like some other people who were with John continued with this desert revival that John was leading and that continued to have a great big impact. I mean, they got their answers from Jesus back at the beginning of Matthew chapter 11, and surely they were satisfied. And they went out and picked up the baton and kept doing what John was doing, pointing people toward Jesus. It does, however, look like that by the time we get a ways into the ministry of the Apostle Paul in the book of Acts, around Acts 19, maybe 20, something like that, we run into a character named Apollos from Alexandria who isn't quite clear on the whole Jesus thing and exactly what Jesus was doing. And Priscilla and Aquila, buddies of Paul, who are clear on the difference between Jesus and John's role, get Apollos straightened out on that. And then we get further evidence later on in the epistles, the letter of Paul, that Apollos came to understand that. But it looks like Apollos was a follower of the John the Baptist sect long after the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. So this thing was much bigger than we probably imagine it to be. That is the John the Baptist thing. And it looks like it lasted a generation or two after the death of its founder, John the Baptist. All right, I just cannot justify stretching this out any longer. Thanks for hanging out with me for a bonus extra long TMBH mailbag episode. Hopefully we covered a few of those loose ends that were maybe hanging out there for you as well. Thanks to everybody who asked great questions. Sorry I didn't get to all of them. There were a ton more from Twitter as well. At Matt Whitman, TMBH is how you can connect with me on Twitter. I do my best. And then once again, r/TMBH podcast at reddit.com is a way to connect with people who are discussing what we have going on here. In whatever capacity you enjoy participating in this conversation, I'm so grateful to you. Thanks for being here. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.